You're here because you want to get smart, fast, on the things that matter, right? To cut through the noise, figure out what's really going on. Well, get ready, because we are plunging headfirst into something that's got, well, everyone talking. The upcoming Superman Legacy film.
Yeah, and this isn't just, another cape and tights adventure. This one's designed, apparently, to be the cornerstone, the actual foundation of a whole brand new DC cinematic universe.
A big deal, then.
Huge. And to help us make sense of this Kryptonian-sized topic, we've got some really interesting material we're looking at. Our main source today is this really lively, pretty insightful discussion from a YouTube podcast.
Yeah.
They properly dig into the initial news, the casting, and all those fan theories bubbling up around this reboot.
Yeah.
And our goal today, it's not just to summarize what they said. We really want to pull out the core insights, look closely at the most compelling fan theories, and understand the weight of launching this whole new DCU with Superman. Why him? Why now?
Right. Okay, so let's unpack that big question first. Why another Superman movie? It really feels like we've seen his origin story like a million times.
Agrees. More times than hot tenders, yeah.
Exactly. The podcast we looked at, it touches on this. It points to DC's, let's say, complex history with their shared movie worlds.
Complex is one word for it, yeah.
We had the darker Snyder era, right, which had a really specific tone, resonated with some, definitely not with others. And then the whole Justice League situation, the behind-the-scenes stuff, mixed reviews.
Yeah, a bit messy. So now we've got this clean slate. Why start with Superman?
Exactly. Why is he the keystone?
Well, what's fascinating here, and what the source material highlights, is the strategy behind it. James Gunn, who's basically the architect of this new DCU, apparently sees Superman as like the ultimate symbol of hope.
Okay.
The ideal bedrock, to build a positive, maybe more inspiring universe on top of.
Yeah.
And crucially, this is important. Unlike some past attempts, this film is not going to retread that familiar origin ground.
Oh, thank goodness. No more exploding Krypton.
Hopefully not. We're apparently diving into a story where Superman is already active. He's younger, yeah, but established. Grappling with the dual identity thing, trying to uplift a world that, let's face it, could use some inspiration.
Right, okay. So he's already Superman, but this is where things got a little, interesting for me reading the source. The podcast mentions a few other heroes rumored to be popping up. Hawkgirl, Guy Gardner, Metamorpho. My first thought was, hang on, is this actually a Superman movie, or are we getting a sneaky Justice League prequel? Is there a risk it gets too crowded again? A bit of superhero traffic jam?
That's a really valid concern. And it's something the source material actually tackles head on. The podcast hosts, they raised that exact question.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And then they offered this pretty compelling counter perspective. They suggest these rumored appearances are probably meant to be more like world-building cameos.
Okay.
Yeah, drawing a parallel to how S.H.I.E.L.D. was kind of woven into the early Marvel films, just hinting at a larger universe.
So planting seeds, not overcrowding the garden right away.
Exactly. That's the idea they put forward. Establish that this world has other heroes, but without pulling focus from Superman's actual story in this film. It's his movie first. But, it does make you wonder, how do you balance that? Setting up a universe without making Superman feel secondary? It's a tricky balancing act.
It really is. Adding a few extra spices, but not overpowering the main flavor. Okay, let's talk about the man himself. The guy wearing the big red S, David Corenswet.
Right.
The podcast guys were saying he's definitely got that classic Superman look, Like he stepped right off the comic book page.
Visually, yeah. Seems spot on.
But as we all know, looking the part, that's only half of it, isn't it? Can he actually embody the spirit of Superman?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? The podcast hosts, they acknowledge the visual accuracy, which is a big plus for loads of fans, obviously.
Yeah.
But then they point to his work in that Netflix series, Hollywood.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
They suggest that she has charm and ability to connect with the audience. It kind of indicates the filmmakers are aiming for a Superman who isn't just, physically imposing, but also has genuine warmth, charisma.
Okay, so more than just the jawline.
Hopefully. But yeah, embodying the look is one thing. Capturing that essence, the inner strength, the unwavering hope, that's the real challenge. Do you think Hollywood really suggests he can pull that off on this kind of massive scale?
That's fair. It's a big leap. And speaking of embodying a character, what about Lois Lane, Rachel Brosnahan? The source seemed pretty positive about her casting.
Very positive, yeah. The podcast described her as basically embodying everything Lois should be.
Yeah.
Fierce, funny, incredibly sharp.
Fierce and funny, yeah, that sounds like Lois Lane. Okay, let's switch gears. Villains. We know Lex Luthor is in the mix. major antagonist.
Good one.
And Nicholas Hoult is stepping into those, well, rather large, traditionally bald shoes. This casting definitely raised a few eyebrows, didn't it?
It did. Because the iconic image of Lex is, the brilliant, ruthless, often bald mastermind type.
Yeah.
Older, usually.
So what's the podcast's take? Why Hoult? What's the thinking there, according to them?
What's really interesting here is the speculation. The podcast hosts, they proposed a potential departure from that classic portrayal. They suggested we might see get this, young tech bro Lex.
A tech bro Lex?
Like drawing comparisons more towards figures like, say, Elon Musk, rather than the Gene Hackman or Kevin Spacey archetype.
Wow. Okay, that's a fresh take. A potentially very relevant one, too, right? With anxieties about tech, wealth, unchecked power.
Exactly. It makes you wonder why they might go that way, maybe exploring a more modern kind of villainy, something that resonates differently today.
A Silicon Valley Lex. Huh, okay. I'm kind of intrigued by that. Now, the podcast also threw another potential antagonist into the ring, the Engineer from the Authority comics.
Right.
Now, for listeners maybe not familiar, she's all about insane mastery over technology, nanotech, that sort of thing.
Super advanced tech, yeah.
So could she be working with Lex, a sidekick? Or maybe a completely separate threat?
Well, the theory presented in the source material suggests she could very well be a secondary villain, maybe even an initial ally of Lex, perhaps.
Yeah, okay.
The idea being she could be the one testing Superman with all this incredibly advanced tech, giving him a different kind of challenge, not just physical, but intellectual, too.
Like a tech-based threat.
Precisely. But the podcast also emphasized that the core conflict might actually be more internal for Clark. About him constantly choosing hope, choosing optimism, over the cynicism that, let's be honest, sometimes defined previous DC films.
That contrast, yeah, that feels important.
It's key, they argued.
It really is. After the generally darker tone of the DCEU, a genuine, unwavering sense of optimism would be such a breath of fresh air. Okay, now connectivity. We've got these other DC projects out there like Peacemaker, Blue Beetle, the Superman Legacy, tied directly into any of that. What did the source say?
The expectation, according to the podcast discussion, leans more towards subtle nods, Easter eggs, rather than direct narrative connections.
Right.
They predicted we might see things like, maybe a brief cameo from Amanda Waller, since she's been in those other recent projects. Or maybe just a headline in the Daily Planet hinting at her activities, something like that.
So acknowledging the shared universe exists, but not getting bogged down in past storylines, letting Superman have his own space first.
That seems to be the thinking, yeah. Establish its own footing.
Okay, makes sense. Right, let's dive into the really fun part. Fan theories. The internet is naturally a hive of speculation.
Always is.
And the podcast touched on some big ones buzzing around, especially on places like Reddit. 2 comic storylines kept coming up. All-Star Superman and Birthright.
Ah, the classics.
Yeah. For those who haven't read them, Birthright is that more contemporary take on his origins, really digging into Kansas, his early years as a reporter. While All-Star Superman, that's that incredible, almost like final chapter for the character. Very poignant.
Beautiful book.
So what's the vibe the podcast is picking up? Which influence feels more likely?
Well, the source material seemed to lean towards a Birthright influence, maybe in terms of the narrative structure. Suggesting we might see Clark as a reporter, maybe actively investigating Lex Luthor's schemes, that kind of vibe.
Okay, more grounded.
Yeah, potentially. However, there was also this really strong desire expressed by the podcast hosts for a moment, or maybe a feeling, reminiscent of the spirit of All-Star Superman. That pure, selfless act of heroism. Something that really showcases Superman's inherent goodness. They mentioned that specific example from the comic, him saving someone contemplating suicide. Just pure empathy.
Yeah, that specific scene is incredibly powerful, capturing that profound sense of hope, the personal impact he can have.
Exactly. It's about capturing that feeling, even if the plot is more Birthright.
That image of just pure, unadulterated heroism.
Yeah.
Yeah, that definitely strikes a chord. What about other Kryptonians? Supergirl has her own movie coming up eventually, right?
She does, yeah, in development.
Could we see a family reunion? Maybe a cameo in Superman Legacy?
The podcast considered that a strong possibility, yeah.
Yeah.
But probably for a post-credits scene.
Ah, the classic tease.
The classic tease. A little taste of what's coming in the wider DCU.
Yeah.
But they really emphasize that the main focus of this film needs to stay firmly on Superman himself. Don't dilute his reintroduction by bringing in too many other huge players too soon.
I gotta let him have his moment.
Needs to be his moment, exactly.
Makes perfect sense. Okay, one theory from the podcast that really caught my ear was about Jor-El, Superman's Kryptonian dad.
Hmm.
The idea of him potentially appearing through, like, artificial intelligence, similar to how he's done in the Superman and Lois TV show.
Like the hologram or AI construct.
Yeah, that felt like an interesting way to keep that connection to his heritage alive without, another flashback to Krypton exploding.
It's a compelling idea, definitely. And it sort of speaks to how Superman's Kryptonian origins still matter in modern takes, but finding new ways to show it. And then the podcast threw out a really bold prediction, a wild take, they called it.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
Well, buckle up for this one. Their audacious prediction was that the movie could actually end with the formation of the Justice League.
Wait, what? The whole league at the end of film 1?
That was the wild take. Instead of the slow, gradual team-up we've seen before, they suggested Superman, Legacy could be the catalyst. Bam! Justice League formed right at the very end.
Wow. Talk about hitting the ground running.
Wouldn't it just... That would certainly be a dramatic, definitive statement about where this new universe is heading. Just signaling, okay, we're doing this connected world right now.
Yeah, messing around. Okay. Now, the podcast also got into some listener-type questions, the stuff someone really invested would be asking. One big one. The music. John Williams' theme, will it be back?
Ah, the music. It's arguably the most iconic superhero theme ever, isn't it?
Totally iconic.
The podcast hosts speculated. Maybe we'll hear a subtle remix, a little nod to nostalgia.
A hint of it, maybe.
Perhaps. But the overall feeling, based on their discussion, was that a new theme is probably more likely. Especially given the impact Hans Zimmer's score had for Man of Steel, even if this is a fresh start. It feels like they'll want a fresh musical identity, too.
Right. A new sound for a new era. Makes sense. Another key question floating around, the tone. After some of the darker DC outings.
Under breath.
There's real curiosity, right? Will the Superman embrace a lighter, more hopeful approach? What did the podcast say about that? Because that feels crucial.
Absolutely crucial. And thankfully, the prevailing word from the source was optimism.
Oh, good.
Yeah. The podcast referenced James Gunn promising a tone that sort of blends the classic hopefulness of the original Christopher Reeve Superman, the movie.
The gold standard for many.
Exactly. Blends that with the kind of humor and fun of something like his own, The Suicide Squad.
Oh, interesting combo.
Yeah. They even gave a great example. Not every heroic act has to be this grim, heavy struggle.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can just be Superman lifting a spaceship with a genuine smile.
Okay, I like the sound of that. That feels like the Superman a lot of people have been missing.
That emphasis on optimism, a more maybe lighthearted approach at times, it's a significant shift. And yeah, could be absolutely vital in setting this new era of DC films apart. Finally, the question that always comes up, Batman.
Always. Will bats show up?
The short answer, according to the podcast's analysis, is probably no.
Okay.
At least not in any significant way. It's just considered too early, to introduce such a massive character right away.
Let Superman have the spotlight first.
Exactly. However, and this is the tantalizing bit, they did float the idea of maybe a visual Easter egg.
Ooh, like what?
Like maybe just a fleeting shot of Superman flying past the Gotham City skyline. Something subtle like that.
Just a little nod, acknowledging the wider universe without stealing Superman's thunder.
That's the idea. A subtle hint for attentive viewers. Rewards the fans, acknowledges Batman exists, but keeps the focus firmly on Clark.
Okay, so pulling all this together then, based on the insights from that podcast discussion, what's the overall feeling? What's the outlook for Superman? Legacy.
I said the podcast painted a picture of cautious but genuine optimism. There seems to be a significant amount of trust in James Gunn's vision, his track record, and also in the talent of the cast they've assembled.
Corenswet, Brosnahan, Hoult. It's a strong lineup.
It is. And there's this hope that they can finally deliver a truly definitive Superman film for, a new generation. The underlying sentiment seemed to be, look, if they can capture even a fraction of the fun and the heart that made Gunn's other projects work so well.
Like Guardians or Peacemaker.
Exactly. If they can capture that magic, then this could really be the Superman movie that fans have been waiting a long, long time for.
Yeah. And as the podcast host pointed out, this new DCU, it really needs this to land well, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. There's a lot riding on this. A significant weight of expectation, for sure.
Absolutely. Well, here's hoping we can finally put some of those less fondly remembered DC moments firmly behind us.
Agrees. Let's hope.
So for you listening, after this deep dive into all the early buzz, the theories, the speculation around Superman Legacy, What's the one element you're most excited about? Or maybe most worried about? What kind of Superman story do you dream of seeing unfold in this new chapter?
Yeah, that's a good question to chew on. Something to ponder until our next exploration.